Fortnite Chapter 6 has new drop spots, new weapons, new heals, and trios as a new competitive game mode. So what kind of strats are Fortnite pros using in Chapter 6? So let's look at some of the drop spots that pros are landing at and why they are choosing them. First up is Tayson, iDrop, and Truelex, and they're deciding to land at Foxy Floodgate. This drop spot actually got them second in the first ever tournament of the season. Now, the benefit of this drop spot is the fact that A, it's center map, which gives them really good rotations, but it also gives them access to these two hills that are at either sides of their drop. Because this is a center map POI, these two hills are perfect positions to go for surge tags, and there's plenty of bricks surrounding it so they can actually refarm any of the mats they use here too. Notice to the east of the east hill is pretty much completely open, which gives you great sightlines to anyone rotating past this direction. Similarly, the west hill gives you great visuals over the west side as well. There's also air sprites and water sprites here, which allows you to either rotate using them or grab extra shield, which is super useful when you're trying to get storm surge damage here. Plus, there's sprite shrines here, it's really hard to say, which can get you some better loot, some shockwaves, some extra heals, and a guaranteed boon depending on what you put in it. But one of the best things about this drop spot is the fact that there's actually some metal here. Most drop spots have almost no metal around them, and there's a ton of teams who are playing without getting cap metal. However, at Foxy, this is not an issue whatsoever. If you notice, Truelex also lands off to a house to the east, as there's another elemental chest here, which has an 80% spawn rate, which gives him a 100% chance at either getting a mask, be it the fire or the void mask, or a boon. There's also two more of these spawns in the actual drop spot itself, so overall, really good. Another heavy-hitting team in the EU is Chicho, Chap, and Teeny, and they're choosing to land at the Night Shift Forest. Now, what makes this drop spot so good is the fact that, firstly, there are 4 elemental chests here. Now, you may say, Reese, I've looked on the map, and I see there's 6 elemental chests here. However, 2 of these are in the vault, and in tournaments, this is actually currently inaccessible because NPCs aren't in, and you need an NPC to enter it. So as of right now, there are only 4 elemental chests accessible here in tournaments. Now, because elemental chests either drop a boon or a mask, this is the best way to get the Void Oni mask. And in this game in particular, Chicho, Champ, and Teeny all managed to get the Void mask, which is incredible for rotating. Now, in this game in particular, they hear a reboot right next to them in Warrior's Watch, and because they all have the masks, they can instantly rotate over here and wipe out the rebooting player, giving them a free elim. But the main selling point of this drop spot is the insane amount of slurp barrels that are around here. Not including the vault, there are 40 slurp barrels here, which is a bit of metal that this drop spot desperately needs. However, it also means that your team are more than likely not using any shield whatsoever, and combine that with the water sprites that are around, that means you're always going to leave this drop spot with pretty much capped shield, assuming there's not like 10 teams landing here. This guaranteed shield means that you can be faster to push teams that are around you because there's a high likelihood you're going to have the HP advantage, which we already saw them do earlier in this clip. The next drop spot is Brutal Boxcars, and currently Thomas HD, Trippern, and Ferdoxy are landing here. Now, there are 3 main selling points to this drop spot. The first one is the train. Now, the train is currently bugged, so it's always spawning at the exact same location. So the first POI it's going to go through is always Brutal Boxcars. Now, if you didn't know, the first team to open the chest on it gets a guaranteed Mythic Hollow AR, which is the best assault rifle in the game, and Thomas HD is the best aim in the game. So these two things make a lot of sense together. So Ferdoxy basically lands on the hill to the east, grabs the barrels here, goes through the toilet, gets some more barrels, gets a little bit of loot, and gets some mats. And by the time the train comes round, the train loot is ready for him to collect. And that's because as the train goes past, Thomas opens the chest for him as to not waste any time. Had one of them just been sitting on the train all this time, you're basically not getting any mats, not getting any heals, not getting any damage. So this strat of passing the train along makes a lot of sense, although it's not really going to be doable once the train bug is fixed. The second reason to land here is the massive pool of water to the northeast. There are 9 fishing holes in total here, which is a ton. But more importantly, fishing not in holes has a 55% chance at giving you a shield fish. So you can basically get infinite shield. But the third reason this spot is so good is very similar to Foxy, as it's relatively centered with great hills. They can create a massive split over the complete center of the map, where Thomas HD is on top of the POI in Brutal, Trippern is on the hill to the south, and then Fred is on the hill to the east, which covers a massive amount of area on the map, giving them 360-degree visibility onto a massive percentage of the map. You may think one of them could easily die given they're so far away from each other. However, because of the void masks and the Typhoon Blade, they can easily just use this rotation just to get straight back to someone if they get pushed by another team. Another interesting thing about this split is that the train will come back around. So if they've lost a new shield whilst trying to get storm surge damage, Thomas can reopen the chest on the train, and Fred or Trippern can then go down and grab that additional shield, heal themselves up, and always ensure they have capped shield no matter how much damage they take. On NA, Peterbilt, Cold, and Ritual are also landing at Brutal as well, so it seems to be a bit of a trend that the best aimers are looking for the best assault rifle. Who would have thought? But another top contender on the region is Bolt, Rapid, and Poyo. Now they're looking to land at the Demon's Dojo. Here, of course, they can fight fight the Night Rose to get the mythic SMG, Night Rose's medallion, which slowly recharges your ammo over time, and the mythic Oni mask, which gives you 50 teleports. Poyo and Rapid basically just instantly land on the boss and wipe it out, whereas Bolts lands down to the southeast to gain a little bit more loot. I'm not sure this split would really work for the most part because Dima's dojo will more than likely be contested in opens, and this drop spot down here will almost likely be taken too in another finals, but in this tournament in particular they just had a ton of loot. Now the good thing about having the 50 charge mask is that Poyo can use it to loot really efficiently. Now because you're not necessarily worried about wasting charges, you can use the mask to get to chests or materials that are further away than you normally would and do it quickly, which allows you to loot really fast and really efficiently. Now if you know anything about off spawn, speed is everything, so this is incredibly useful. Another benefit to this drop spot is the fact that there are 3 earth sprite spawns all around it. One to the north, one to the east, and then one to the south. No matter what weapon you give an earth sprite, it will give you a gold weapon in return. And basically every item is an even 13% chance. You can also give it consumables to give yourself some more heals. So if the earth sprites do spawn, and I'm not necessarily sure the spawn rate of them, but if they are there, this is absolutely worth it. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Demon Dojo is so good, because it has access to these 3. One of the other things that's important in chapter 6 is that there are actually a lot of these god bricks that give you a ton of brick per swing. For example, in this game, Kami, who lands at Lost Lake, immediately lands and can grab capped brick from these 4 spots right next to each other, so it doesn't waste any time on a bunch of crappy brick somewhere. There's a lot of other drop spots I can mention, but Seaport City is probably another one that's really important because this has the highest collection of metal across the map. As we already know, metal is a big problem. Also, bird exists. So what are the loadouts that the best players in the world are looking to carry in chapter 6? Well, first is always a hollow AR. There's almost no variation to this outside of the fact that sometimes one player of the trio will carry the precision SMG just to make sure the ammo is a little bit better distributed. And only in opens do players really carry the Fury Assault Rifle if they're looking to drop high elimination games because it's a little bit better in close range. For the shotguns, almost every single pro player is using the Sentinel Pump shotgun. There's no point in using the Oni shotgun. It is horrific. And the auto shotgun is pretty much only good if you want to run in someone's face. For the mobility item, players are pretty much either going to choose the Void Oni mask or the Typhoon Blade. And the decision between the two basically is grab a mask. If you can't find a mask, take a blade instead. However, a lot of the rotations, the blade has been nerfed, but we'll come back to that later. Then for the heals, there's very minimal white heals being held in trios right now, and that is because of Siphon. Siphon, if you do not know, which has been added this season, is 75 white HP over 5 seconds. So pretty much any elim that you get, you're going to get your white health replenished and not your shield. So this means that pros are carrying less medkits. That doesn't mean that they don't carry any medkits, they are still carrying some, it's just that they don't have to carry a ton. This is especially true because most players aren't just going to be fragging out every single game, and they might need them to win heal off as well. So players are pretty much carrying as many water sprites and big pots as they possibly can, and then minis if they don't have either of these two. And whilst I'm talking about heals, I obviously mentioned earlier that a lot of players are also carrying shield fish, and if you haven't fished them up in the early game, or if you've just run out of shields, you can do what Reet does here and box up in the center of the 3rd to the 4th zone, and by the time you need to leave this box, you can have fished up an absolutely insane amount of shield fish, which for solos, you're probably not going to be able to carry all of them, but for trios, there's almost definitely going to be a little bit of a surplus, so you can restock here. So yeah, there's some items that may have some applications, like the Fire Oni mask, but I'm yet to see it. And this was mainly trio loadouts. Honestly, for solos, it's pretty much exactly the same. Most people are looking to still take the Void Oni mask over the sword, but both are really good for solo mobility regardless. So how are people actually using these rotation items? Well, let's start off with the Void Oni mask, as it's basically the coolest, and we'll start in solos, and then I'll show you how these things are actually used in trios when all 3 members have to use them. So if we use the same game that Reet fished up all of the shield fish in earlier as a good example, you notice he has 14 charges of the Oni mask in the 4th zone. From here on, pretty much every single rotate is just use the Void Oni mask, box, refarm if you can, repeat as soon as the next zone appears, and you just kind of continually do this every single time. However, importantly, when he gets into the 7th zone, which is the second parcel zone, notice the position that he puts himself in, which is the northwest of this zone, so essentially right on the storm line, which is away from all of the other players. This means that there's not going to be a bunch of people boxing on top of his head, so when he goes to use the Void Oni mask for the next rotate, he's not going to get blocked. And because there's no one here, he's free to refarm all of the wooden brick as well. So despite the last 3 zones being completely max pulls for him, he's still 136 builds, almost completely capped because of the style of rotation. From then, the moving zones are relatively simple. He just stays on a high layer and then almost always looks directly upwards whilst he's using the Oni mask to ensure that the orb doesn't fly out into the storm, so when he teleports he doesn't just die. However, this is incredibly risky. Firstly, he gets absolutely lasered for 100 damage whilst doing this once, because whilst you're up in the air, the height player can easily see you falling and beam you. Secondly, if you're not already on a really good layer, you're gonna have to use a lot of mats to get yourself out of that before the Oni mask becomes actually quite viable. So instead of that, you can do what Tayson, Trulex, and iDrop do in this clip, where they get to the front side of the zone, and then rather than just throwing the orb straight up into the sky, they actually throw it into the storm in front of them, and then when the zone opens up, they can simply teleport to that. This just prevents them getting blocked, and you can kind of repeatedly do this over and over again to ensure you're always having a safe rotation. Now in Reed's game, he basically did this all the way up until the end of the 11th zone. As you notice though, he's now completely run out of mats because he didn't get any refreshes, and there's still 18 people alive. So the final moving zones in solos are really stacked because of these mobility items, so it's actually really difficult to get a lot of placement points. Reed plays out the rest of the game really well, playing medkits in Storm to keep himself alive, but he was really smart in keeping a single use of the Void Oni mask to teleport to the final player who is playing heal off, which allows him to kill him and win the game, actually qualifying him for the PlayStation Cup finals on Asia, so on high ping for him. Now in trios with the masks, basically most of the pros are just ensuring they throw it at the exact same time or as close as possible. If you rotate way later than the rest of your team, you're way stuck behind. Another team will probably see you do this and really easily get a beam on. So that's why pros always make sure they all basically use the mask at the exact same time. It's also useful if the person who's calling this out uses a marker to show where they are aiming, which allows the other two players to follow easier. Now for the Typhoon Blade, the way this is used in the mid game is really different from the way it's used in the end game. So at the start of the season, you could do a bunch of these cool rotates where you either edit a wall or do it underneath a ramp where you just basically sprint jump into it. But unfortunately, this was a bug. It's a shame because these kind of rotates were really fun and actually made the blade extremely useful. However, in endgame, most people weren't really doing too many of these rotates anyway. For the most part, they were just using it like Swizzy does here for the increased movement speed and the increased jump height to kind of get yourself out of some scuffed layers before tarping. Then in trios, again, a lot of the teams were doing these cool kind of rotates, as you can see here, but when it came to the end game in trios, for the most part, teams couldn't really set up these kind of rotates all that well, so they instead just tarped and when necessary, used the blades for increased movement speed. So before the nerfs, teams obviously were taking this a lot if they didn't have the Oni mask, but now I think you might be better off just with another heal. I'm not 100% certain on that. However, in solos, if you don't have the Oni mask, I do still believe that the katana will be worth it because ultimately that mobility in endgame as a solo is just way more valuable. Now, a big part of competitive Fortnite is always the mid-game objectives, and there's really only two in Chapter 6 currently. The first is the Wandering Shogun X, which is essentially the Shogun X boss that spawns around the map. Now, the thing about the Wandering Shogun X spawn is that it has one of 5 weapon spawns. So it can be either the Mythic Twinfire Shotgun, aka the Balls Shotgun, the Mythic Fury AR, the Mythic Oni Shotgun, the worst gun in the game, the Mythic Surgefire SMG, horrible, or the Mythic Pump, which is amazing. Now, the problem is this boss takes ages to kill and it uses so much ammo, which in a high-level competitive game is hard to come by. So it takes a bunch of time, wastes a lot of the resources you valuably need, and 3 of the 5 mythics you get from it aren't very good. So what we're seeing for the most part is that players aren't really bothering wasting their time with the Wandering Shogun X boss. However, the other mid-game objective, which is Loot Island, seems to be criminally underrated right now. Shogun X's medallion can be found on Loot Island by killing the boss, Shogun X, and it gives you infinite sprint, and whilst you're sprinting, makes you invisible. Now, last season, there was a very similar medallion which made you invisible while crouching instead, and for the entire season, it was completely underrated. In fact, it was so bad people were dropping it, but there was a select few people in solo cash cups who were picking it up and realized that they could basically just crouch their way through every endgame. But in Chapter 6, Shogun X medallion is way better because rather than having the crouching speed, you now have the sprinting speed, which is around 3 times faster. Despite this, people really don't feel like it's worth fighting for, and it's usually just taken by the first team who gets up to Loot Island. But in this game, Lenz's team goes up there and gets it for free, but Yasin and Voltiax end up going down in 8th place. But because the medallion is so good and Lenz uses it really well, he can just sprint through the entire endgame, being completely hidden from all of the other players, allowing him to pick up free refreshes. He's then able to solo clutch all the way up to a top 3, something that would have been way more difficult without the medallion. Unfortunately, winning the game was $1,200 and they missed out on that though. This item is even better in solos, which is going to make it incredibly strong for the solo cash cups this season. But Chapter 6 also implemented a bunch of new movement mechanics, so I was really interested to see how the pros are actually utilizing these in tournaments. The answer is they're not really. Now, I think over time, people will get much more used to these mechanics. So maybe it's just because it's the start of the season and most players haven't started to adapt to these yet. Or maybe it's just because they're not that applicable in fighting. But we're just not really seeing pros use any of the wall scrambles, the wall kicks, or any of these new mechanics. Now, one application I personally have been messing with, definitely not a pro, is using the wall kick whilst still in a box. Since wall kicking is essentially just another jump, you can still shoot as you're doing this. But if you've wall kicked and you're still holding space when you land, you do a roll, which is incredibly difficult to be hit while you're doing this. If you do this in front of another player, it is incredibly difficult to track you. meaning you can essentially pump them as you're doing a wall kick and then roll behind them, and because the center pump has a high fire rate, you can essentially just shoot them again from behind. Again, very limited application, but it's just something I've been messing with personally. Me and Destiny Jesus have just released our Christmas bundle, which includes the Fighting Masterclass, the Solo Masterclass, and a pre-order of the Trios Masterclass that we're going to be dropping next year. This also includes any Masterclass that DJ has done before, so it's a ton of information. If you use code RESUB, it's also 25% off. Links are all down below for that. If you don't care about that, care about this video, which you can click on right here.